So the previous video was super brief and really just to try to give you enough to go into Illustrator and start trying things out. Now I didn't really show you much, but that was sort of the intent because I think it's important that you're willing to try things even if you've never seen them used before. So we're just going to go ahead and relaunch Illustrator. And we're going to actually look at a few things, explain a few things, and go into a little bit more detail. So once again, my Illustrator's being a little rebellious and doesn't want to pop me up the little new prompt, but that's okay. So we've got a variety of things here. When you're creating a new one, you might be used to like pixels instead of points, but Illustrator uses points. It's very common in the design world. You'll eventually get the hang of points if you use Illustrator and InDesign and stuff like that enough. But even if you're not familiar with it, you can put other things in and it will convert it for you. Like 3 inches converts to 216 points, or 50 centimeters converts to a whole bunch of points. So you get the idea. Let's try maybe 25 centimeters. Sure, that looks fine. I'm going to round that down just to a nice even number. Alright, now press OK. So we have our workspace here. So this is just the measurements that I chose on the previous window. Now if I change my mind here, I can very quickly adjust my measurements down here with the artboard tool. It looks sort of like a tic-tac-toe board, and I can make it more what I want. And if I hold down and don't release, I can actually see in the little tooltip there what the current measurement is. We've got all of these tools over here. I'm not going to go over all of them. I showed you just 1 or 2 last time, just as examples of creating the smiley to show vector and raster. Now if I click and hold down, I have quite a few options in here. Last time I used the ellipse tool, which creates circles or ovals. And if you hold shift, like I said last time, that will give you one that is equal in width and height. Now one of the nice things about Illustrator, which is true of most vector software, is that when you create something, it's not permanent. Because everything is being defined by these math terms, you can go in after you've saved it. So let's say that I save this, and we'll just call it temporary since it's just an example. And I'll go ahead and close it. And I'm just going to go ahead and reopen it. So temporary. I can still modify this, and I can change the stroke width, and I can change the inside color, and there's still a lot that I can do with it because it's being encoded as math, not as individual pixels. So it's saying create a rectangle that starts at a certain set of coordinates, it's a certain width by height, and it has certain colors within it, and a certain border color, and any of that coding can be changed easily. If I was doing this in Photoshop or a different program, let's actually just go ahead and show you real fast. It would not be near as easy to change because it's defining it not as mathematical terms, but instead as just a series of pixels that happen to be one after the other that happen to be in the shape of a square with what happens to be a black outline around it. Like so. Now if I want to change the color of this square, I can't just click on it and switch the color here. I have to do something a little different. I have to either come in here with the paint bucket and make it a new color, like so. And that's actually not too bad. It looks pretty decent. That's not too terrible. But as you're doing more complex things, you can start to develop some issues. Let's go to dark blue. And if I zoom in, let's see, is this perfect? You can actually see there's a little line up here where it where it's separated. Didn't quite color that in right. And if I were to choose something more complicated, like perhaps a gradient, well, you can see that really didn't work the way that I meant to. Let's see. Let's use the marquee tool to try to reselect this. And let's grab our gradient tool and let's choose, we'll just a simple black and white gradient. Now, if we try to change the color of this, it'll I don't know, we'll see what happens. That's not too terrible. Yeah, that's working decently. What if we want to change it back to a solid color like blue? Well, that's kind of a problem. That's not so easy. And I can go in here and I can keep clicking, but that's a little inefficient. And this is still rather simple. We're just talking solid colors. We're not talking any sort of complicated design. So this could become problematic. However, if I go back to Illustrator, if I want to change this to a gradient, I can just switch this to gradient here, and now we have a gradient. If I want to change the colors, I can modify my colors. Let's see, maybe mid-saturation, maybe a green. I kind of like that color. We'll choose this handle. Sort of a mid-tone again, maybe a purplish color. And I can switch it pretty easy. And if I change my mind and I want to go back to a solid color, I can just switch back to solid. Easy. Or I can go to no fill, and now I have this empty box. So that helps make things a little bit easier, especially if you're making a design that might have lots of changes, especially if you have a client who's not sure on what colors they want things. Now, not only that, but because all of these are defined as mathematical equations, each object that I create is still a separate object being defined by math. So what that allows me to do is that allows them to be separate of one another, and I can move them around without worrying about one deleting the other. And I can do something similar in Photoshop, but if I make a mistake, then it's not going to be so great. So I've got my square here, and if I decide that I want to make a circle, and let's say maybe red, and well, that's already a little bit more painful. Little line there, go away line, there we go. So now we have a circle. But if I try to move the circle, the whole thing moves because they're bound together because it's a series of pixels. I have actually lost the back of my square. Now I should have made a new layer and created my circle on a new layer, so that way I wouldn't have deleted part of my square. But, you know, if you're tired and you're working, you know, things like that can happen. See, now I can move this around. But my circle there is still bound to my square, which in Illustrator isn't a problem because each thing is its own separate object. Even right now, in my layers panel, they're both on layer 1, but if I bring this little drop down here, you can see the objects are separate. They have separate paths. And you can do something sort of similar in other applications, but it just tends to work better in a vector-based application like Illustrator. So yeah, so that's a little bit more about sort of how Illustrator works and one of the advantages to a vector-based environment.